let's switch gears here and talk about Job and his friends. So we kind of got the 40,000 foot view there of the whole book of Job during Sunday school. That was excellent. But I was thinking about Job and his friends and kind of wondering a little bit about what their experience was like and seeing if we can kind of put ourselves in their shoes. And so I thought I'd start by just asking a question. Have you ever had a friend that you were surprised to find they had sort of a totally different side to them that you didn't know about? Maybe it was like positive or maybe it was negative, but somehow they surprised you in a way that you really weren't expecting. Byron. I remember in college, our dean of students was just an incredibly straight-laced guy. Like, he, obviously being the dean of students, you kind of expect him to be, he's kind of keeping the rules. He works at a conservative Bible school. That's kind of his job or whatever. But we also went to church with this guy, and even when he wasn't on the clock, like, he just seemed like a very, cut and dry guy. And then I found out I played in a worship team, and I forget how it came up, but we were hoping to find somebody who played lead guitar in our church, just for a special music number. And so he stepped up. He says, "Oh yeah, I play quite a bit actually, like at home." Like he says, I used to play in bands and stuff, but and then we're like, and I'm just imagining this guy, like, it was just hard to feature him as like a really great guitarist, let alone. So anyway, we're just, well, okay, whatever, we'll let him play with us. And he just like knocked our socks off. Like, it wasn't just like elevator music, it was like face melting distortion guitar coming from this guy. I was just like, wow, I really didn't expect this from this guy at all. So that was kind of a new side that I hadn't been expecting. So that, it can be positive, oh wow, a new talent that you don't know about. Sometimes it's unfortunate, it's like, okay, this person has some really wacky ideas that I hadn't expected, or they wake up screaming in the night. Those are all really good examples. I was thinking of that because I wonder if that was what it was like for Job with his friends. And so as we get in this morning, we're going to see that their friendship kind of takes a turn, I think, as we get into his story, but it's good to start at the beginning. And for our we just get a few quick verses to introduce Job and his friends to us. And so we're not going to, thankfully, read the whole of the story. Obviously, it's a longer one. But in Job chapter 2, verse 11, we get a little bit about his friends that show up when he's in trouble. And so verse 11 says, "When Job's three friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, heard about all the troubles that had come upon him, they set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was." So we're not actually told how Job and these three friends become friends. We just are told that they are his friends, and they travel from a distance to come ostensibly to comfort and console him, though, spoiler alert, we find out they're actually really terrible at that. But we do get a little bit of a hint just from their names. They're identified not just by, okay, so-and-so from wherever, but they're identified as being from foreign countries. And we're not exactly sure on some of what some of it means. The Bildad the Shuhite in particular, that's sort of a vague placement, but we do understand from all of them they're not Israelites. They're foreigners from another land. And so we have to take from that what we can. The suspicion from reading the scholarship I looked at this week is that they're probably business partners in some way. That's probably, at the very least, how Job initially has contact with these guys. And so they all hatch a plan together to come and visit Job in his distress. And it starts off really well, actually. They come I think in the sense of compassion, of just showing up and let's just be silent with Job. They've kind of made a pact together to show up and just listen to what he has to say. And so they just sit in silence. And there is something of consolation about that. And they have good intentions of wanting to come and comfort and console Job. But as we see in Job's story, of course, it would be a really short book if they had just said nothing, and maybe a happier book too. It's been often said. But of course, after a while, they feel they have to speak to Job about what's happening. But it's one important word there, and it's translated well for us in verse 11, is their intention is, it says, they met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. And that comes to an important point for us as we think about being friends with people. It's important to be able to both sympathize and to empathize with other people. But it's critical in Job's story that his friends are just sympathizing with him. And so that's a fine distinction, especially in English. So I just want to explain that when we sympathize with somebody, that means we feel bad for them. We see that they're having a rough time and they're suffering, and our heart goes out to them. And that's a good thing to do as a friend. But empathy is a little different. When you empathize with somebody, it's not just seeing that they're in distress and pain, it's understanding why that's taking place. It's usually indicative of the fact that we've had this exact same experience in some way or another, and we understand how the person feels. So sympathy kind of is a little bit more distant and saying, I can see that you're in distress. I don't really get it necessarily. I haven't been there myself, but you're in pain, and as your friend, I feel bad for you in that way. Empathy is a little more intimate, and it says, I know what you're going through, and I feel for you in that. And it's a little bit, speaks of a little stronger connection there. And so we want to have both, and we want to exercise both in our friendships, but Job's friends in this instance only seem to be able to sympathize, to see what's going on and not really understand it, but they feel bad for Job. And we'll see that becomes significant, of course, through the discourse that they have with him. And so we realize for all of their good intentions of showing up and wanting to comfort and console Job, they actually do a really bad job of it. They give Job bad advice, and they turn out to be bad friends on this occasion. And so that's kind of what turns the corner for us. As we talked at the beginning about, sometimes we're surprised by what a friend does or a surprising feature to their personality. Sometimes we get into a new situation with friends and we realize the surprises that they're not actually that good of friends at all. I think I noticed this a lot in college. You'd have friends, all through the school year, and then you might maybe end up working with them through the summer or helping out at a church together or whatever, and it's kind of a different venue, and you see another side to this person, and you realize, oh, maybe this person isn't the great friend that I thought they would be. And this is what happens with Job. They're good friends, I think, they're smooth sailing, but when there's trouble in Job's life, all of a sudden he realizes really how shallow their friendship is. And that is, I think, partly why Job is a wisdom book. So we saw in the overview of the video, it's part of 3 wisdom books in the Old Testament, and it's probing this question of, does the world always reflect the goodness and the justice of God in it? Does everything that happens line up with that? But another aspect of wisdom that I see in the book of Job is the wisdom of being a good friend. And the reality is that it is a question of wisdom. It's not a moral question. You can be a bad friend and still be a good person. But what we're asking in this whole series is, how do we be, obviously, we all want to be good friends, and that's a wisdom question. That's, how do I do something better? And in fact, we're usually looking for the best thing. And so thankfully, to my mind anyway, if I'm come to the realization I'm not the best of friends, God says quite clearly in James chapter 1, if I have any wisdom problems, I can go to God and ask for wisdom, and he will give that wisdom to me on the basis of knowing that I'm actually going to follow through on that. I'm going to ask sincerely because I actually want to do the things that will make me a better friend, even if that is a sacrificial thing. So I can ask and then go and do it. But Job's friends, as we'll see, give bad advice and are generally bad friends to Job throughout the discourse of this book. We're not going to read all of it, but I've marked a number of places on your outline if you're looking there. There's a number of references, and they're mostly Job commenting on how terrible his friends actually are. But I do want to go to chapter 6 and just read a few verses from chapter 6 where he comments on this after hearing particularly Eliphaz speak and try to console him and try to help him through his misery. And he says this in verse 14. He says, "Anyone who withholds kindness from a friend forsakes the fear of the Almighty. But my brothers are as undependable as intermittent streams, as the streams that overflow when darkened by thawing ice and swollen with melting snow, but that stop flowing in the dry season, and in the heat vanish from their channels. Caravans turn aside from their routes. They go off into the wasteland and perish. The caravans of Tema look for water. The traveling merchants of Sheba look in hope. They are distressed because they had been confident. They arrive there only to be disappointed. Now you too have proved to be of no help. You see something dreadful and are afraid. Have I ever said, 'Give something on my behalf. Pay a ransom for me from your wealth. Deliver me from the hand of the enemy and rescue me from the clutches of the ruthless? Teach me, and I will be quiet. Show me where I have been wrong. How painful are honest words, but what do your arguments prove? Do you mean to correct what I say and treat my desperate words as wind? You would even cast lots for the fatherless and barter away your friend. But now be so kind as to look at me. Would I lie to your face? Relent. Do not be unjust. Reconsider, for my integrity is at stake. Is there any wickedness on my lips? Can my mouth not discern malice?" There's a lot wrapped up there, but Job is basically accusing his friends of saying, well, if I've done something wrong, accuse me to my face. But of course they can't. They've got vague notions about how God must operate, but they know of no way that Job has misstepped himself. And so he calls them to account, and he, in that first part of what we read, he compares them to what's called a wadi, which is just a desert stream. We don't have them where we live, but they're very common in the Middle East. And it is, as described, it's a stream that can be quite large through the spring as the winter snows melt, as the wet season carries on, but then into the dry season, the summer and the fall, they dry up. And so what can be a really great source of water through part of the year, all of a sudden goes stone dry. And as Job describes, traveling caravans would obviously, as you're going through an arid region, you depend on sources of water. And if you go off searching for this, that's extra energy searching for water that gets used up, and you're worse off than if you just stuck to the road and carried on. And Job says his friends are like that. His friends are like that. We just, of course, last night had this huge downpour, and that's when these streams would fill up, but they quickly disappear. And so, as we talked through this whole series, one of the key features, probably the key feature that the Bible underlines is, something that describes true friends, is that they're loyal. They're faithful to you. They're dependable. And Job is telling his friends that they fail on this very basic account. Job's going through suffering. He's going through a difficult time. He's lost his family. All of his children have been killed. He's lost his home. He's lost all his livestock, his means of livelihood, of earning an income. And even his wife has come to him after all this has happened and says, "Why are you holding on to your righteousness? Just curse God and die." Like his wife tells him, "You'd be better off if you committed suicide." And so Job is trying to understand this experience, and And his friends come, and after sitting silently, now they're holding forth. And that's what Job is really complaining about, is that they're not saying specifically, oh, we saw you sin, and this is why this is happening to you. They're just saying, well, we've seen this has happened to you, so you must have sinned. They have these theological ideas that they're sharing with Job and his suffering, and rather than making him feel better, they're just making him feel worse. They're trying to interpret his experience, and really their harassment is only increasing his suffering. And so he's disappointed with his friends. They're like a stream that's dried up in the summer. And Job, on top of this, one of the surprising things as we read Job, as we read Proverbs, and particularly the Psalms, is the stridency with which Job and the psalmists plead their case with God. They don't mince words. Job is wild in his agony and confronts God very openly with his pain that he's going through and wondering why this is happening. And Job's friends are a little more cautious, a little more dignified in their approach to God. And that's maybe not a bad thing, but in this situation, it keeps them from interacting with Job on a real level. And I think that's maybe the big lesson of friendship that we get from Job, is that we have to go to the place where our suffering friend is. We have to be able to meet with them there. And if we're not willing to go to that spot, then it's hard to be a good friend in that situation. Job wants to talk to God about what's happening, and his friends just want to talk about God generally. Job is hurting. He's a friend in need. And I put on the outline there that sometimes when we're a friend in need, what we need is a friend that bleeds. And I say that not just to be cute, but to say that, when we're in a painful spot, sometimes what we need is somebody who will come into that place of pain and suffering and just be there with us. And Job's friends start out well with that. But sometimes we need people who will be able to go the extra mile as well. And of course, that brings us, as followers of Christ, we immediately recognize that that's precisely what Jesus Christ does for us. And I'm going to flip, actually, out of the book of Job. I'm going to change 2 letters on that name and go to the book of John. As I was thinking of how Jesus does that for us, I thought of this incident at the beginning of chapter 8, where he's approached by a woman in a really tight spot as well. And maybe it was just wanting to get away from just the negative picture of how Job's friends fall short, but seeing how Jesus, in his wisdom and in his compassion, does this for us. And so this is an instance where I think Jesus shows his compassion, but also his wisdom on how to be a good friend to somebody. So the story begins actually in chapter 7, verse 53 of John. It says, "Then they all went home, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them." This is kind of his standard thing that he would do in Jerusalem. Now the teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. I think if they really cared about the justice, there'd at the very least be 2 people standing in front of Jesus, not 1. But Jesus bent down and he started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away, one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. Then neither do I condemn you, Jesus declared. Go now and leave your life of sin. A good friend speaks the truth to us. Jesus speaks the truth to this woman. He says, go and sin no more. He knows what's happening in her life and doesn't try to hide that from her, but he also has no condemnation for her. He has compassion for her situation. Jesus, I think, first and foremost shows wisdom in seeing what's really happening in her life. He shows empathy in not just feeling bad for her, but being removed from the situation. He empathizes, and most of all, he listens. Of course, as we see from the book of Job, that's probably the main failure of his friends, is they probably could have just gone on listening, and they would have been a lot better friends than they were offering unsolicited theological advice. And so there's a difference there. True empathy enters into the pain of another person that sort of standing off second or third person doesn't really allow. Of course, when we look at Jesus Christ, we see that, of course, he's more than just a friend to us. And that brings us this morning to our celebration of communion together. The reminder that Jesus is more than just a friend to us. He's our high priest. He empathizes with us. He not just understands our suffering from a distance, but he enters into it with us. In fact, he goes there first. As the book of Romans tells us, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. He suffered for our sins before ever we gave them a moment's thought. But as high priest, he sympathizes with us as well. The book of Hebrews tells us that Jesus went through suffering and trial and temptation to know what that was like for us. And in fact, through the ministry of the Holy Spirit, he continues to bring prayers and requests before the Father on our behalf. That through the Holy Spirit, he hears even our inwardmost groans and sympathizes with us. Jesus suffers for us, and he suffers with us. I was actually thinking about that this week too, that gives us hope as well, because he overcomes that suffering. He leads us to a place beyond the suffering. We have the phrase that misery loves company. And we recognize that, it's better to go through something together with somebody else, but it's even better to have somebody that has gone through this and knows the way out, has overcome it entirely. And that's what we have in Jesus Christ. We have hope. And even in the book of Job, though of course Job, being long before Jesus was born, would not know his name, he looked forward to a time when God would take care of the injustice in the world. He would redeem the pain and suffering that people go through. And even Job understood this on some level. And so in Job 19, he writes what are to some of us very familiar words. He says, "Oh, that my words were recorded, that they were written on a scroll, that they were inscribed with an iron tool on lead or engraved in rock forever." In other words, he knows that his suffering means something more than just this fleeting experience. But he also knows this. He says, "I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes, I and not another. How my heart yearns within me." My Redeemer lives, he tells us. In the present tense, Job knows that there has to be some way out of this suffering, and he anticipates the coming of Jesus Christ. And so in communion, we have this awesome privilege of not anticipating that somehow, someday, God is going to make it right, but knowing that through the power and the work and the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, we get to experience what Job could only hope for one day. We have that hope abiding in us, that Jesus Christ paid the price for our sin and was raised to life. that he's gone through all the pain and suffering that we could ever possibly imagine. And he's paid the price so that that ultimate pain and suffering that we might have, separation from God, need never happen because of what he's done for us.